Okay, looks good. Good morning. My name is Hilary Naylor, and I am a member of the Ashby Village tech team, working with a team from Ashby Village and the UC Berkeley Retirement Center on a password management and organization and creation workshop. And as part of this work, we have invited a guest from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Bill Budington. And so I'll ask you, Bill, to introduce yourself and say a little bit about your work at EFF and what you'd like to talk about today.
For sure. So yeah, my name is Bill Budington. I'm a senior staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're a nonprofit based in San Francisco, and we work on digital civil liberties and privacy and security work, so that when you go online, your rights come with you. Some of the work that I do at EFF is to program certain extensions in your browser to make your browsing experience more secure. I also advise some of our lawyers on technical matters, write blog posts and the like. So yeah, I'm here to talk about password managers today.
Okay, great, thanks. Well, our audience today will be members of Ashby Village, an organization that helps seniors age in place by providing services such as our tech team provides, and members of the UC Berkeley Retirement Center, who would be drawn from all different walks of life from UC Berkeley. So, but primarily we're talking about seniors mostly living at home and needing to feel secure and online and using their passwords. So let's start from the basics. Why is a strong password important, and what is a strong password?
Yeah, so strong passwords are important because with the computing power of today, it's very easy for machines or bots to guess passwords in the matter of hundreds of thousands, millions of guesses per second. So the real trick is to make a password. Sorry, my cat is. The real trick is to make a password that can we? I don't know if we can cut.
That's fine.
Okay.
Let's do it.
The trick is to make a password that is complicated enough so that a computer can't guess it, but it's easy enough for a human to remember. And there are a few tricks here. It turns out that the human mind is really good at making stories when you weave together a few words. So one of the password mechanisms to choose a password that we recommend is to choose a few random words, because it turns out computers are really bad at guessing words in combination. If you think about it, each new word represents a combination or a potential of any other word that could possibly be there in the dictionary. So that's how computers think about it, and they go through these lists called password lists in order to guess passwords. So for humans, you can choose a few random words, and those words, if you kind of weave together a story, those words constitute a pretty good method of choosing a password. Say like 4 or 5 random words from the dictionary chosen, and you kind of the canonical example is correct horse battery staple, and these are just kind of 4 random words that are chosen. But in combination, you can kind of think of, a surly horse, with a staple, and that kind of just forms a picture in your mind about a password that you can choose that's secure enough so that a computer won't guess it.
And what about the length of the password? How important is that?
Yeah, so the length is important. And when we say like password length, we also mean like passphrase. So it's not just, you know, four or, you know, like 16 characters that are randomly chosen. That'll be really hard to remember. But password length in general is the lengthier the password, the better the password. So that's certainly a factor. You know, you want to increase the length of the password while not making it harder for you to remember.
Mm-hmm. Uh, in our preparation for our workshop, we found an online site which will tell you how long it will take a computer to guess your password. Right, so you put in a I don't know a 4-letter word or 8-letter word, and it's nanoseconds or something. And playing around with it, we found if you type the same thing over and over again, like we typed my dog Fido, my dog Fido, my dog Fido. By the time you've done it 10 times, you've got a password that can't be guessed in a bazillion years. Even though it doesn't contain any of the requirements that sites usually ask you to include in your password, like, you know, upper and lower case, numbers, non-alpha characters, and so on. It just is all lowercase. So
Yeah.
would that really make a good password to have that repeated short phrase?
Well, I think that algorithms that are guessing passwords are getting better and better over time. So one thing that an algorithm that's trying to guess your password could do is take that password list and then just repeat it as you've done, you know, yourself when choosing the password. So it really kind of depends on the password guessing algorithm that's being used.
Used on this site.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So I would not recommend just like repeating a word that, you know, over and over again. I think that as password managers, I mean, as password guessers get better, that'll become kind of a weaker methodology. They'll start catching on to that. So I would recommend, you know, going through a methodology that you know, kind of you know, involves choosing pretty random words. One easy way to do this is to open up a book and then flip to a random page, you know, without looking at anything, just like point to a word and choose that word for the first word of your passphrase. And if the word is the, then choose another word.
Yeah.
But do that 4 or 5 times, and then you have a password that you know, you actually, you know, you have a pretty good secure passphrase.
Yeah.
And
You
you
have
know
to
that
put in, the sites require you to put in some extras, right?
right.
Yeah, it must have a non-alpha or numeric character. So then you have to play around with it a bit.
Right, and that's one of the good reasons, kind of leading into our greater discussion, is using a password manager. So if you choose a good random passphrase of 4 or 5 random words, that could be what's called your master password. And the great thing about password managers is that you don't have to remember a bajillion passwords that are all different across the web. I think that we kind of have the intuition that we shouldn't, you know, use the same password across every site. But some of us are like, well, how do I do that when there's so many sites that I'm logging into? I have my Gmail, I have, you know, my Facebook, whatever. How the heck am I gonna remember all these sites?
Right.
So, you know, with a password manager, the way that it works is that it's a vault. It's a computer that program that you install, and it's a password vault. And you have one master password, you know, kind of like a one ring to rule them all, that you enter when you open up the password manager, and then it contains all the passwords for the sites that you log into, and they can be however random and fulfill however many password requirements that that site needs.
Right. Right. And when people talk about complex passwords, it seems like different people have different interpretations of what complex means, right? What you described some people would say, well, that doesn't seem complex because they're real words. They just don't string together in any meaningful way. Whereas the kind of passwords that are generated by a manager, they look complex because there's strings of characters, not words. So is there an overall definition of complex, or would you just say it depends on the need?
I think there is a mathematical definition
Oh,
of what complexity in passwords is. Really, it involves a lot of complicated terms like entropy and combinatorics and all this kind of stuff.
okay.
we, we don't need to know about that in order to choose a good passphrase, because there are good methodologies out there that people have established. But just kind of think of it in the way that a computer would. For instance, if you're trying to guess a passphrase and you're a computer program, you need to have a list that you go through one by one in order to try to guess those passwords. And if that list comprises of every word in the dictionary multiplied by every word in the dictionary multiplied by every word in the dictionary 5 times over, and that's a lot of combinations that it needs to try. Whereas, for instance, if you choose one word in the dictionary and then modify the O with a 0, and then put some numbers and then put some asterisks at the end, well, it looks kind of complicated to us when we're looking at it, but password guessers, password cracking programs have factored that in, and they know how to crack those passwords pretty well now.
Yep, yeah, that certainly is a popular construction. The word, year of my birth, a couple of @ signs, that'll do it. See that a lot. Have you, well, you described the advantages of a password manager. What do you see as the disadvantages? I mean, obviously you can forget what you chose for the master password. That's one.
Right. So you need to remember that master password unless you're using a service which, has access to that. You kind of have to keep in mind that that involves a trade-off, though. If you're storing your master password with a third-party service, then they'll know it and they'll be able to access all your passwords, right?
Right.
So one thing that often is looked down upon, but I think it's actually a really good way to store this, is to once you choose a master password, then you write it down, and just don't keep it on a notepad on your monitor. Lock it in a safe place. It turns out that humans are really good at keeping safe little pieces of paper in our wallets. So if we have that on hand, if you have a safe place to keep that in a lockbox somewhere, then keep it there until you actually are in the habit of remembering that. You know that password now. You don't need that stored in a physical place anymore. Then you can throw it out or destroy it optimally. Don't just throw it in the waste bin.
But you are going to be using it every day.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good
maybe
method.
Several times a day.
Yeah, and there are some password managers which actually force you to type in your password, more so that you start remembering it.
Get used to it. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I do is I'll set an actual reminder, set an alarm or a Google Calendar reminder every week or so, or even every day if it's like the first time I've chosen that password, in order to remind me, just to jog my memory, just to say, what was that password that I chose yesterday? Every day. And then I'll start getting the habit of it. And then it'll be every week or so.
Well, that's a good idea. All right. We'll offer people that trick. And have you any personal experience or stories that you know of people who had weak passwords, like we just described, a word and a birth date or something, and got into trouble, some kind of trouble with it, with having that it was cracked and they lost something or were hurt by something?
Well, a friend of a friend once had a password that they reused over every single different site that they had.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And one day there was a breach at one of the sites that they had stored their password with. And so they had that password divulged on the internet. And even though it wasn't the, person or the hackers that divulged it, they posted it somewhere. And that caused that password to be known everywhere, so that other hackers were able to try that same, email address and password combo on different sites.
Oh,
And, then they had iPhones ordered to, through their Amazon account, and had a whole kind of issue with their credit and everything.
oh.
So this really does affect, various aspects of our lives, and can really affect us really negatively if we have bad password hygiene.
Yeah.
So I think that the best thing to do is to kind of have these passwords randomly generated in a password manager. And we were talking about the password managers that are available, and some of them are based in the browser themselves, like Firefox or Chrome or Safari, and then some of them are third-party password managers. So I think that the best thing to do for now is to use a third-party password manager like LastPass, 1Password, or Dashlane. And these password managers allow you to randomly generate passwords. And one additional advantage of using a password manager is that they not only store your username and password, they also store which site you're using it on. So that if you're subject to a phishing attack where a hacker sends you an email and says, hey, log in to this site, and it looks like google.com, but maybe the O in Google is a little bit off, and so you think it's google.com. Well, you go to log in and it doesn't come up with, in your password manager. Well, that's a good protection against phishing.
Oh.
So your password manager actually protects you against phishing attempts in that way too.
Oh, that's great. I hadn't thought of that before, or even realized that was a possibility. Because we gave a workshop for our members on phishing and internet scams in February, just before the lockdown. And one of the things that came out of that was the need for a workshop totally committed to password management. But it's great to have that very tight connection between the two. We'll definitely include that for our members.
What's funny is that in a study last year by Google, it showed that people over 50 use different passwords on most sites, but they didn't use a password manager as much. So that's kind of interesting to me, because how do you remember all these passwords? And I think that a password manager is one way. Now, there are a few caveats, as you mentioned. You have to remember that password. Another thing that is important to keep in mind is that not all password managers sync between devices.
Uh-huh.
So if your computer fails for some reason, that the hardware fails or whatever, then you really don't want to be up the creek when you have, when you have all your passwords stored on that one device.
Yeah.
So you need to think about that and get one that syncs between devices, preferably between maybe your desktop and your phone, or have a backup device, or just one where it allows you to restore passwords when you type in that master password.
Right. Yeah, that's an important feature too, especially when you're traveling, maybe, and using a laptop that you don't normally use on a day-to-day basis at home. You need to have whatever you have at home synced to that laptop, but you need it to be secure as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of these password managers have apps on Android and iPhone that allow them to sync between the browsers that you use on your desktop and your phone. So you can kind of use them in both contexts.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, do you have anything else you would add? Any other words of advice for our audience?
You know, just kind of use the best of your abilities to just one up your password security, and use the resources that you have available. Don't be shy to ask a friend if you don't know how to use these password managers. They probably, you know, will have some tips for you, especially your techie friend in your neighborhood. You know, use those resources, and I think that'll go a long way.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Bill. Really appreciate your time today.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.